Right. This is going to be part 4 of the StarCraft 2 history. This one goes from early 2011, the foreigner tournaments that happened around the same time as the rise of the first waves of champions, MC, Nesty, MVP. Also happens at the same time as the GSTLs I mentioned, which is the next wave of champions that are going to come up. Squirtle, MMA, Dongrigu. I will say the timeline of the online tournaments I talked about don't happen until later in the year, later half of the year, the ESV TV ones, where Tasia Life and Jockji rise through. But I put it in the last one just because, in terms of thematic connection, that it makes a lot of sense, and also it becomes critical when you start seeing those types of tournaments disappear, and not necessarily because of just money, but also because of the fact that there are less like players that play in them that are new, and so that's kind of like a crisis moment that never gets resolved in StarCraft 2, at least in Korea, and arguably abroad as well. Now we're going to talk about the foreigner tournaments. There are a few of them, some more important than others. IEM 5 EU finals. That's the one. That's like the first one that happens. I think it's around January. Yeah, that's the one that Show wins. Now Show was a Swedish Terran, and he's not really well known. He's not going to go down in all time lists by anybody probably. I will say, as a player, he was very smart, and hit the way I describe him is slow. He had very slow APM. It was very controlled, but what made him as good as a player was his intelligence, specifically how he built his builds. And I'd say his best matchup was TVT by far. Strangely, I think his TVP across history was his worst, but he did beat White Raw here in the finals to win that title. And he's generally been praised for CVT, even I think by Bomber, who had played him and lost to him, or lost the game to him. Uh, Shows an interesting case because he falls off later on in Hero. Heart of the Swarm. That always fucks me up. Basically, part of the reason he falls off is because of the way the game changes. Like his very slow, like methodical style gets fucked, especially in TVT, gets fucked up when speed turbovacs come into play, and that's kind of something you have to consider when we're talking about skill over time. Because yeah, it seems like obvious that players get better over time, but on the other hand, it isn't necessarily the case just because way the game changes, the way the meta changes over time as well, and it doesn't take into factors like how fast you are learning and innovating these paths. Whereas newer players that come along, they just jack your shit and then move on to the next step. Like as Noon says, I'm only tall because I stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. So, and that's kind of how it is. So when that's kind of how it is. I just have to think about it in very specific ways. So you move on, and then Rhett wins Assembly, and Assembly it was an okay tournament. I will say this about Rhett because I think this is one of his better achievements in his career, and he was hyped as like maybe one of the best foreigners at that time. Like that's kind of like the hype that was around him because he was a very good Brood War foreigner. He had very good macro. He was very good at droning, which was basically like the entire like thing about him. And when he did talk about StarCraft 2, his knowledge seemed pretty good about it. But he never really lived up to the hype almost ever, I'd say. And he had some weird weaknesses in his play. Like early game, he famously kept getting like killed by all-ins. Late game, when we eventually get there in like 2012, he wasn't particularly good at it, but that required a very specific kind of mindset that didn't suit his skills as a Brood War player. I could talk about that for a bit, but basically, in 2011, ZVT late game didn't exist, and it's not because the players were bad. I actually think that for whatever reason, that's like the first thing that pops into people's heads. The real reason why ZVT late game didn't exist is because there was no 2.5 tier unit. And what do I mean by that? I mean there was no Devourer like there was in Brood War, so there was no way to secure like another base and defend it easily. And so what happened in StarCraft 2 is you would get the basic combination in Zergris Terran, which is bio at the time. The reason Roach Hydra doesn't exist is because Hydras suck balls at this moment, and they will continue to suck all the way until they get buffed in Legacy of the Void. And now back to the real issue is mass roaches become less effective as time goes on, and nobody wants to deal with that. Like, you eventually have a point where you can use it, but use it as like a regular staple, but that also comes with the fact that you needed a 2.5 tier unit to make it stable. And that 2.5 tier unit in StarCraft 2 ends up becoming the Infestor. But the Infestor at this point was trash. Like, the fungal wasn't particularly dangerous at all. And the amount of investment you would need like dramatically hurt either your Realist count or your Baneling count. And you would think to yourself, well, Stefano was able to do it, right? Like, Stefano was able to run that Ling Infestor style later on. There's a big difference in the fact that Stefano's prime was in the era where Queens had 5 range. This is the era where Queens had 3 range, where maps were worse, where you would be more likely to be stuck on 2 or 3 base. So what would happen is there's no transitional unit for a standard Zerg vs Terran game back then. So there was no spellcasting unit that could get you safely from Ling, Banelings, Mutas into Ultras, and if you made that transition, if you made that jump, you would usually die. And it's not like even Ultras were that good, actually, because they were very finicky to use. They stumbled over themselves. Like, you needed something to get the Terran units stuck in place, and the innovations of creep didn't exist until Seal comes into play later on. And even then, like, it would have been hard to like spread that creep very far when you're considering that Hellion or early like Marine like harass early on can easily kill the creep tumors without getting much damage done by the queens themselves to protect it. So, and also without like a Queen 5 range, you're not going to get that 3 base Ling Infestor style going. I mean, theoretically, maybe you could have, but my guess is the way the game played out, the way the maps played out, a smart Terran would have got the 1-1 before you did, and he would have been able to harass your 3rd base to the point where it would have been useless or possibly a detriment to your own economy. And at which point you are stuck with a bunch of Infestors with Fungals that isn't particularly strong against a bunch of Marines, upgraded Marines, your upgraded Lings, about even, but the Metavacs should out-heal what you're doing, and they should be able to outpace what you're doing. The only like possible scenario where you might be able to reverse this is if you had enough Infestors to like neuroparasite all of the Metavacs, but that doesn't seem very likely to me. At least that's how I theory crafted it in my head. Obviously, we can't go back and play it, but that's obviously like a point you have to think about. If we're talking about players back then, how their skills rate up to later players later on, and how the meta works. Right. So where was I? So basically, that Red wins assembly. So he kind of gets hyped up as a possible like foreigner strength, strong player that's coming through. IEM World Championship. Ace wins it. This is like Ace's best tournament in his career. He used a bunch of Phoenix builds, which are pretty cool, but overall, Ace as a player is generally irrelevant. I don't think he'll be on anybody's, like, he won't be remembered, I'll put it that way. Even by me, he's, like, not well remembered. And the other interesting point of this tournament was there's a triple tiebreak between Squirto, Show, and Sock at this tournament. Sock being a Protoss player from Germany. He had some pretty decent upsets throughout the years, moved on to Heroes of the Storm as far as I can recall. Now, the next event ends up being TSL, and TSL is this online event that Team Liquid ran, known as the Team Liquid Star League, and it was incredibly hyped up for a few reasons. The primary reason being that there wasn't as much content back then. The second reason being that it was a cross-pollination between a bunch of foreigners and a bunch of Koreans, and even though I've noted down a bunch of foreigner events and a bunch of LAN events, the reality was like it was majority foreigners at foreign events, and it was majority Koreans at Korean events, And it's not like anybody was crazy and thinking like the Koreans weren't the best. They were, but we wanted to see this combination, this conflict, and see who comes out on top. And even though it was online, it was still something. It was still something. And there was actually a bunch of pretty good games here. This marks the rise of the two big Swedish names to come out of StarCraft 2, Thorzane and Naniwa. And they are, in some weird way, like intercorrelated with each other. Like you can't really tell the story of Naniwa without Thorzane or vice versa, because they both come out of this TSL, and they both kind of like had a heated rivalry with each other, and they both had the opposite strengths of each other. So they're it's a very strange sort of relationship, and I pretty sure they hated each other. That's the feeling I actually get when I saw them interact, when I saw them when I saw people interview them. So I'll get into it. Thorzane was mostly a calm, like mild-mannered Terran player, as far as I can tell. What made Thorzane special was he was like Sho, except on steroids, and what I mean by that was like mental steroids. Like he was way smarter than Sho. He actually had this ability to prepare very well, and he used it to knock out Fruit Dealer in a huge upset. Then he beat out Noni in the next round, beat out MC in the following round, and this is actually a great matchup if you want to go back and watch one of Thorzane's like historic matchups is Thorzane versus MC, because I think like it was revealed later on like both of them had been in Korea, and so the ping disadvantage didn't exist between the two of them. But basically this is one of the first times you see a late game macro play in TVP, and Thorzane comes up with the idea to use mass ghosts, and this is something MC hadn't seen before, and like they go back and forth on Whirlwind, which is arguably one of the best maps of was it Whirlwind? It might have been Alter Zim. Let me check real fast, because obviously like they had the same tile set, so I don't actually remember what it was called back then. Oh, Tal'Darim Altar. It was called Tal'Darim Altar. Right. So Tal'Darim Altar ends up being like one of the best maps, even though like there was like fucked up weird positions, and because it was a 4-player map. So the two of them play on that map, and it was an incredible series where they both kind of like spread across the map, and it's like and every time they fought, it ended up being like this epic fight, and Thorzane would win out because he had mass cloak ghost, and he would take out all the observers, and the MC would be stuck trying to fight. Pretty great game, and Thorzane is kind of proven to be like the first guy to figure out how to play that style of TVP late game. And he actually upsets MC there. He goes on, beats Kaz, and then beats Naniwa in the finals. Naniwa's run isn't quite as epic, though it was pretty dominant from what I remember. It was, let's check real fast. He beat Rhett, Goody, because Goody had upset Nesty with a mech build. And obviously, like, Goody's like a funny sort of character, if you want to talk about him a little bit. He's like a German mech player, like literally only played mech his entire career. And he was only dangerous if you didn't know who he was. But if you knew who he was, it'd be pretty... It's annoying to play against, but you could beat him. That's generally the entire like summary of his career. Naniwa, he played Cruncher, and Cruncher is a funny story because Cruncher had beaten Idra, and then he had beaten Mondragon, and famously, like, that's the apex of Cruncher's career was he pissed off Idra, and Idra said he was shit or something. I forget the exact words, but Idra was right, even though Cruncher had beat Idra. Cruncher was shit. Naniwa beat him. Naniwa played Hasuabs, another German Protoss, similar to Sok in a way. I'd say Hasuabs was probably a better player though. Naniwa beat Hasuabs, and then he met Thorzane in the finals, and it was a very close series, actually a very epic sort of best of 7. And Naniwa kind of chokes in the final game, and this becomes a huge problem, like for Naniwa going forward. Where on Tal'Darim Altar, Naniwa gets pretty good spawns on Thorzane, and he's able to harass the middle lines just with the Colossus from a very good position, but he never commits to an all-out attack. And so Thorzane's able to recover, he's able to build up army, and then he's able to kill Naniwa because his army is overextended and wins the game, so to speak. And this is part of the choke factor because also Naniwa had been up 3-1 in that series before Thorzane had won the last 3 games to win the entire series. And this sort of marks like Naniwa's one of Naniwa's big weaknesses as a player was he got into his own head in the finals. Very similar player to Sue in that sense, where he would break down in those finals, and even though he could beat any of these players he had met in the finals, and he did beat almost every player he met in the finals in a different part of the bracket in a different tournament, but if he met them in the finals, he would often break down, and that was kind of like a weakness of his, and something I don't think he ever got over as a player. And obviously, this is the start of their rivalry. And in terms in terms of styles, I already said like Thorzane's like a very slow, methodical type, and he was given the nickname the Spoon Terran because he was so slow it felt like he was killing you with a spoon, so would take forever for him to kill you. Whereas like Naniwa was the ultimate Warcraft 3 turned StarCraft 2 player, in the sense like this is exactly how you would imagine a Warcraft 3 player would play. A very good Warcraft 3 player would play if he played StarCraft 2. He had amazing micro. He was very aggressive. He had very refined one and two base builds. Like there was this joke post about him doing only 4 gates for a long period of time in beta or something back then. And basically Naniwa was the type of player like he understood he thought of the game in very particular sense. Like he tried to force the game into an area where his micro could shine and then he could outplay the other player. I think that's the kind of player Naniwa was overall. And at times it worked, at times it didn't work. And he was always kind of frustrated that he couldn't make it work, even though I'd say pound for pound he was as good as any Protoss player micro wise for a long period of time. I won't say the best. I think Parting will always be the best, but that's like Parting's the ultimate micro player in my eyes. So that's the beginning. That's the beginning of Naniwa, so to speak. And was it? And the way this tournament is structured, it went from March to May. So in between that point, Naniwa had also played at MLG Dallas, and MLG Dallas was the point where, like the story goes, like Naniwa, if he didn't win that tournament, he was going to retire because he felt like if he could have won that tournament, he felt he would never be good enough to be the best. Obviously, he did win that tournament. He did smash it. Actually, Naniwa was right in the sense that not many people gave him much competition during that tournament. I will say this is a random side point because I forgot to mention it in part 1 in MLG Dallas 2010. There was this player called Pain User who got 3rd place at that tournament, and usually I wouldn't mention something like this because that's literally his only achievement, but he did go on State of the Game once, and he was one of the guys. Apparently him and LS had theory crafted something that actually became hugely important throughout the entirety of Wings of Liberty Protoss vs. Terran, where they had cracked open the math and figured out that if you did shield on the sentries and you got +1 armor, that would take like 56 shots for a Marine to kill the Zealot. And this actually becomes critically important, especially later on when they fix up the way charge is used. And I just thought that was I thought that was something worth mentioning just because he was the first player to come up with that. He was also a player who used this weird like mech Thor Banshee Hellion build that I think the only other time I've ever seen something similar to that. I've seen it a few times actually, but like LS randomly used it. Like one time I saw him play at some tournament, I forget what. But moving on, that their careers weren't very long. The people at this point were getting more hungry for foreigner versus Korean matchups, right? Obviously, so during the same time as the TSL3 was going on was the GSL World Championship, March 28th to April 9th, and this is considered MVP's second GSL title. It's contested as to whether or not it's an actual GSL just because the format's different. And people say like he had an easy bracket. I don't know what they're talking about. I'll get into that later. But basically, in terms of players, MVP beat, that it was definitely a top tier tournament. Definitely something to be proud of. Definitely can see why somebody want to call it a GSL. I don't think it is just because it didn't have the preparation style that is normally associated with the GSL, but definitely a huge tournament in its own right. And the premise of this tournament was get the 8 best Korean players from GSL, so based off of seeding and whatnot, based off of like overall results. Then get the 8 best players from the foreigners. Didn't work out that way because obviously there were invites, there was online qualifiers, stuff like this. But they got 8 foreigners and then throw them against each other. And first was in a team match, and the second was in the actual single limb round of 16 man bracket. And the team league itself was pretty fun. It went all the way to the wire, where Demaga had taken out MVP, and then he played Nesty, and Nesty won the entire thing. But it was pretty impressive. I'd say the best player among the foreigners is probably either Demaga or Sen, and both of them had shown a pretty strong Zerg play at that tournament. Shout out to TT1. He actually beat Nada with a double cannon build in the natural Nexus because he was countering a Cloak Banshee build, which was pretty popular at that time. So it was a smart play by him and pretty good build to be honest. And beyond that, let's see here. This was also the tournament where White Raw beat MC in a PvP in that same team league matchup, and that basically like made White Raw the most popular like foreigner for a little bit. Like they even made a documentary about him or something. I'm not even sure if the documentary ever came out though. Right. So MVP goes on to win this entire thing. Another thing to point out here is like Demaga beats Nesty in the best of 3 regular tournament, even though he lost in the team tournament. And it's the first time Nesty ever loses his DBZ on LAN for StarCraft 2. So it was a pretty big thing, and Demaga obviously was very good. And he'd actually prove throughout his career that even though he didn't have that many opportunities compared to somebody like Idra or somebody like Huck, he had upset potential for sure. And as for MVP, the reason I think it's kind of bullshit to say this was an easy tournament is because of the guys he ran into. First round, he ran into Huck. Huck was still, in my opinion, top 2, top 3 Protoss at the time. Ran into July Zerg. July Zerg, like I mentioned, basically got second would be getting second or had gotten second already in GSL finals. Son, even though he was like a fuck up early on in StarCraft 2, he had this was like his first peak, and he was actually very good during that time. Arguably top 5 Protoss, and then Marine King was the second best Terran player after MVP himself. So it's not like it was a fucking easy run for MVP. So it's why it's like a legitimate run. As for TSL, I'm going back to TSL a bit because there's actually one match I want to point out here. I was very good, but you won't hear about it from anybody else. It was QXC versus Genius round 1. And the reason this is very good is for a few reasons. Obviously, like apparently QXC had been going fucking mad practicing for this with Adele Scott, and he had been complete trash in the scrims apparently. And then at some point he straight up asked Adele Scott, what do I do? How do I get better? And like Adele Scott's only answer is just stop being shit or something stupid like that. And then that pissed off QXC so much he practiced even more, and then he eventually came up with he eventually became pretty solid at the matchup. And it was on Silnaga Caverns. That's the map you want to look for if you actually look up this game. It's QXC versus Genius, and what happens is like the two of them kind of split the map, and it's a very back and forth affair. And then what ends up happening is they both start running out of resources, and then QXC pulls off this genius move that's only ever done by Thorzane ever again. And what he does is he builds a bunch of late game Reapers, and the reason you build late game Reapers in this scenario is because they obviously have very high mobility, but there are a few downsides. First, you need the tech lab on the barracks, and for a majority of Terran players, obviously you want to split it like 50-50 between a reactor and a tech lab for the Marines and the Marauders. But on top of that, Reapers themselves take a very long time to build relative to the Marauder or Marine, so you're opening yourself up to a potential hit from the enemy opponent. But the other reason you wanted the Reapers this time that you wouldn't want them in, say, like Legacy of the Void, even though Legacy of the Void are arguably stronger is because Reapers at this time still had the 40 damage grenade, and this is just base damage with plus 3 weapons. You'd probably get like 55 damage a hit from a Reaper. So with imagine 20 Reapers or so, and then all of a sudden you're like destroying the entire base within seconds. And that was the threat that QXC used to beat Genius in that game. So it was a very good game. It's actually, I think, QXC's best game, even though a lot of people point out to the game where he all killed IM as his best achievement. I think it's either this game or the game he plays against Steer at the very final edges of his career where QXC is played his best. So those are, so that's wraps up TSL, that wraps up the World Championship, wraps up Dallas, and the final tournament we'll talk about is NASL. NASL was it has a funny sort of legacy. I'll put it that way. It did a lot of things right, but it did a lot of things too early, and it didn't necessarily have the budget to do all the things they wanted to do. And they did come up with the idea of like filler content to an extent, and they had used a bunch of good they had done a lot of good things relative to how much money I think they got, which was I think nothing. So this is also the place where Mr. Bitter, Rotterdam, Greetorp, and one more guy like kind of made their names. I forget the last one, but I think he's in Hearthstone now. But basically, it's NASL was this huge project. It was also created the NASL sound guy meme because obviously that guy fucked it up, and I believe In Control actually has an entire like reflections of his own talking about this during this time because he was about to become one of the main casters of this tournament, and he talks about all the stuff that went on behind the tournament, and obviously like what happened later on with like Slayers like trying to fucking with them and stuff like this. But basically for this tournament, production wise it was a complete disaster. Game wise it was pretty good. So basically this first NASL teaches every tournament organization a valuable lesson in the sense that everything can go wrong, but as long as the finals are good, everything can on some extent be forgiven and forgotten from the community. And this is basically what happens with the Puma versus MC finals, because this is one of the best finals early on in StarCraft 2. And this is before Puma became the emblem of 1-1-1 builds, which was kind of like a cheese build against Protoss. But is it really a cheese if it works every time? That's a question for you. And MC, so two of them played like macro builds, two of them played very aggressive, and the two of them traded the series back and forth. It was a very, very, very thrilling series at the time. I'd say it doesn't quite hold up as well nowadays. Just my opinion. I actually think the Puma Hero series holds up a bit better. But just in terms of entertainment and thrills, it's pretty good. And the other things to point out during this tournament is like this is Puma's first real rise to the top. And at the event, I think EG was there, and like they asked about him like, this guy's legit. This guy's real. This guy's the real shit. What's your contract? And then Puma's like, what contract? Because apparently like Puma hadn't been paid anything. It was like, and then EG offered him some money or something, and then Puma switched. Puma talked it over with TSL. He switched over, and then TSL kind of like did some kind of basically pretended that Puma had betrayed all of them or something weird. Didn't make much sense just because he wasn't getting paid. I don't know how you can call that betrayal. But anyway, this is also because Puma wins this tournament, he gets onto EG. And that was a pretty good event for him. The only other few things we want to talk about, I guess, Dark Force, German Zerg player. And the reason I'm talking about him is because he had a very interesting style, very controlled. It really did feel like he was playing a chess game at times, and I found out later it was because he had played Go a lot, and so he was very like controlled and very methodical in terms of his positioning. But obviously he wasn't that great of a player, didn't have that many results overall. I will say another reason I'm pointing him out is because he actually transitioned into gambling on StarCraft 2, and he really took advantage of those early days because nobody had the people who were running the betting sites for them didn't really understand what they were doing, and the Dark Force took them for a ride. and then eventually Dark Force got hired by them. The other player to talk about is Sen, and Sen ends up being one of the best foreigner players of all time from Taiwan. He was another guy from Brood War, but unlike many of the others, I actually think he lived up to the hype, so to speak, and he really pulled it off for them, even though I've heard in terms of work ethic, he wasn't always altogether there. He's also the only like foreigner to have won like a StarCraft 2 event and a Hearthstone event back to back in like 2 days of each other or something crazy. And he actually could have gone to the finals of this particular tournament because he had played best of 5 against MC in the semifinals, and he had actually gotten a huge lead in the 5th game, but then he choked in the 5th game because his idea was, I'll just go max since I'm ahead on economy, and since MC can't attack, I'm just gonna build mass broodlords, and then MC's like final like saving grace was, I'm gonna go mass void rays and hopes it kills whatever the hell Sen's throwing at me, and because Sen didn't scout, Sen died to the mass void rays basically. And then Sen would go on to play Jelizerg in the 3rd place match, where he would beat Jelizerg pretty soundly. And I should point out, like, Sen was very good at ZVZ. He had actually given Nesty a very close run for his money, and Nesty was the best ZVZ player of early StarCraft 2. This was back during, like, GSL Open, Season 3, I believe. Right, so that concludes this part of the international tournaments of early 2011. I will say, it basically gives us a bunch of the main actors that show up, because like in the first session, in the first part, you have Huck and Idra rising. This one you get Naniwa, Thorzane, and then like a few other guys like Sen, and we finally start getting into this area of StarCraft 2 where Korea meets the foreigners, and things are about to explode. All right, see you next time.